Hey everybody, welcome back to another version, chapter, ongoing saga within the stream of consciousness realm of the Woodruff cast. My God, do I have a show for you folks today. Little bit of a backstory. I belong to or participate in a Substack group that is run by Seth Werkheiser called the Social Media Escape Club. And if you're not familiar with Seth's gathering place, I highly recommend you check it out. I'll put a link in the text that is related to this post. The reason I bring up Social Media Escape Club is we were on there the other day. A lot of us meet there on Zoom and talk about how we are moving forward as artists, writers, musicians, etc., escaping from the purview of Meta and Elmo. So somehow we got on a discussion. I can't remember how it was, but one of the colleagues there, a guy named Mark Ingleson, brought up the topic of heavy metal music and astrology. I think I had, come into the group, announced that that was my skill set, and I we emailed back and forth, Mark and I, because I said I can't fathom that there's some aspect of astro astrology related to heavy metal music. Well, Mark got back to me right away, sent me a link over to my guest today, Caleb McCoy's website, which is appropriately enough titled Heavy Metal Astrology. So I got a hold of Caleb and said, I got to find out what in the hell is going on with heavy metal astrology. And he and I met last week just in prep to doing this show today, get to know each other and go over some of the topics that we want to discuss. So strap yourself in because this is going to be an enlightening and very Martian, enlivening hour or so. So please welcome my guest today, Caleb McCoy. Well, Caleb, thank you for joining me today on the cast. I was, as I said in the intro, really intrigued with the notion of heavy metal astrology and how you decided to put that as the category or the rubric that you do your work in as an astrologer. What was when did you realize in your career path that that was going to be the fork that you were going to go down, or the path and the road you were going to go down?
Yeah, good question. And thank you so much for having me. I've been really excited about this. I also love that preparing to talk about Mars and we're both wearing our red flannels.
And it's snowing out up here, so I got
Right,
into
right.
the
It's
flannel.
also a dead giveaway that we're both in the Pacific Northwest too, right? Like outfitted like
Yes,
lumberjacks.
yes.
Um, Anywho, heavy metal astrology kind of grew out of a desire to marry my two great loves, right? Which is astrology and heavy metal. I've been like a heavy music aficionado since I was like in middle school, right? And for me, it was like realizing that what intrigued me most in the realm of astrology are the quote unquote malefic planets, Mars and Saturn, and that heavy metal as a musical genre is very much concerned with martial topics and Saturnian topics, and just sonically, it often sounds either martial or Saturnian or both, you know? So, using music to understand astrology and also astrology to understand music, it just kind of made sense given my proclivities, you know?
Right. I was struck by the this beautiful opening that you have on your website at, of course, heavymetalastrology.com. I'm going to read this because I just found this really beautiful. And I think it adds another layer to what you were just saying about the musical element
Mm.
and how you were drawn to that. So on the splash page of your website, it reads, "On the day of your birth, the stars aligned and sang your life song. There is meaning in its melody and purpose in its pitch, although some notes are dazzling and others distorted. As an art, heavy metal is about transmuting sorrow into song and transforming hurting hearts into art. Come, let us turn iron and lead into gold." Now, any alchemist would go A plus for that opening. What inspired that to be the way you greeted potential clients and students and whatnot?
That's a good question. I think, I wrote that a couple years ago now, and what comes to mind is just the musical metaphor, but which is something that is not original to me, but something kind of underlying the astrological canon for a long time, right? Like the harmony of the spheres.
Mhm.
And that this notion that the planets are some kind of a chorus. And insofar as like including the quote unquote malefic planets as parts of that chorus, there's like a desire to somehow see as necessary or rightful their inclusion, even if the notes they play are discordant or dissonant, right? I think, for instance, of like Tolkien's cosmogony in the Silmarillion, where the like Iluvatar and then the different like deities he creates, they like sing the world into being basically. But that
Mhm.
Morgoth, the like sort of like chief villain of that cosmology, introduces like dissonance, right? Disharmony. And like there's a lot of use of like dissonance and just like what are abrasive sounds in heavy metal music, but then there's also the like cathartic satiation of when then like harmony is redelivered after a lot of dissonance or a lot of like, I don't know, harsh vocals, jagged squealing guitars and so on, right?
Yes. Well,
So
and that's
insofar as like making that relevant to the life of a client, it's like let's look at what are the more discordant parts of your experience. What are some of the more difficult things you've undergone, but what is like the meaning that you're able to like wring from that?
one of the things when you and I were talking earlier that piqued me like big time was this thread of connection between like Black Sabbath, uh, the astrologer who's considered really the father of modern astrology,
Hmm.
Alan Leo,
Hmm.
and the guy that did the planets, his Holtz, what's his name?
Gustav Holst.
Gustav Holtz. When now you mentioned that that has a lineage into heavy metal. So
Hmm.
I've got to hear about the father of modern astrology with
Yeah,
Black Sabbath.
yeah, completely.
So,
So Black Sabbath is often credited for inventing heavy metal as we know it. In 1969, they wrote a song called Black Sabbath. It's the title track of their first album, Black Sabbath, right? And it opens with a chord progression that's called the Devil's Tritone, right? So it's this looming, sort of sinister sounding chord progression that throughout sort of Western musical compositional theory is known as being like really like sinister, right? The devil's tritone. So they used that, and then the song ends with a march as well. And both those pieces, they said later came from or were inspired by Gustav Holst's Mars, the Bringer of War, which is the first song in the Planet Suite, which is this like contemporary symphony suite of songs about the planets, right?
mhm.
So, and Gustav Holst, just in terms of composition, proved a big influence on a lot of modern composers, right? Like John Williams, who did Star Wars, for
Hmm.
instance. He cites Holst as a big influence. Gustav Holst himself wrote the Planet Suite in part because he was a big astrology fan. He was introduced to the work of Alan Leo through his brother, and also, I believe, introduced directly to Leo at some point. I think they met in like Mallorca at some point
Wow.
in the 1910s, and a lot of the not just the titles of the songs, like for instance, Neptune the Mystic, but a lot of the themes or the ways in which Holst sort of sonically paints the planets in the suite was inspired by Alan Leo's descriptions of the planets, specifically the way he talks about them in the Synthesis, that
Mm.
text of his. So, yeah, in a sense, the origins of heavy metal are astrological and directly tied to the planet Mars, right? Because that was the song that inspired the boys from Black Sabbath to write that song, the first heavy metal song.
That is amazing. I absolutely love that.
Hmm.
I've been I've been sort of steeped in Black Sabbath, not that I'm listening to it, but the book I just finished on Jeffrey Dahmer. He Dahmer was a huge Black Sabbath fan, so that got interwoven in there somewhat, though I kind of riffed on it in my imagination. You have a particular, and am I correct on this? You have a particular focus, not just because of Mars's connection to heavy metal, but also Saturn. Would you say you're like an expert when clients come to you, like for working with their Mars? Or how does the Martian aura impact, or does it, lean you in one direction over another in your work with clients?
Uh, okay, so I don't know if I would at this point denote myself some kind of an expert, but more like a specialist, right? I've gone in and out of phases of only just talking about Mars with clients. I'm currently in one of those phases, although I think I'll pivot out once the ongoing Mars retrograde in Cancer ends. Um, but yeah, I think like that's just been a primary curiosity of mine for the past nearly 2 years now. I observed personally that during the years during which Saturn was in domicile, right, in Capricorn and Aquarius, it felt like there were a lot of really interesting and nuanced pieces through which people were sort of trying to reappraise Saturn. Like Saturn really got his time in the sun, or maybe out
Hmm.
of the sun, right? Like during those years within sort of like our field, where a lot of people seem to have this like desire to sort of gain a comprehensive view of Saturn and also see Saturn as necessary, right? Not just something to be feared, but a necessary component, right,
Yes.
of our system, our symbol set, our lives, and so on. But I felt like as I myself approached a year, like an annual perfection year, a couple years back that I knew would be ruled by Mars, I was kind of reflecting on just the degree to which I felt like Mars hadn't gained that same reappraisal or
Hmm.
had that same nuanced take. So that's just something I started doing sort of experimentally at first with some close friends, just trying to like tease out how do I put this? Like tease out more layers of Mars persona rather than it merely being about anger or even drive. More about like I don't know, conflict, war, strife, like all the civilizational ills that get put on Mars, and trying to
Hmm.
figure out okay, what is if Mars too is necessary? What's like the necessary way or the rightful way Mars can show up in somebody's life or in their chart?
Yes, it does. And it leads to another question I wanted to ask, because this is something I try to do, especially with taking the gender and sex
Hmm.
off the table with the lights and the planets. When you, how do you experience Mars when it is taken out of the associations, especially in Western culture,
Sure.
with masculinity.
Yeah, like Mars, I feel like a lot of our like stereotypical go-to images for Mars is like a cigar chomping like cowboy or something, right? Or like the power lifter, um, or just like the violent angry man, right? And like when you pull back and see that Mars is more about like disruption, friction, heat, sharpness, there's all these ways you can see like the inherent necessity of fire or friction or heat insofar as like movement is impossible without friction, right? Um, there is meal unless you're eating raw. Meals are impossible without heat, right? Or even without knives. Even if you're not eating meat, like you need a knife to chop your vegetables. You know, um, so like stepping back and seeing uh like an ungendered Mars, I think would be seeing it as something potentially present in all activities of life, or the expression of any person or even animal. Like we often think of like wolves and dogs with Mars, but
Mhm.
so like a she bear is also a quite fierce and protective martial animal, right? Things like that are ways to expand one's perspective, I think.
That's actually, yeah, I think that covers it in a new way. Now, of course, you're going to get a Mars in Pisces question coming your because natally, that's where it is in my horoscope. I think uh, that might make me privy to like some other facets of Mars. One of them being, well, I just see it in my own life where I cannot handle uh, uh, abuse of like animals or children,
Hmm. Yeah,
and feeling very protective of underdogs or people that don't have an ability to stand up for themselves
hmm,
and fight back. And I kind of, so I tune into that protective element that, I mean, Mars doesn't have to be in Pisces for somebody to experience that, but I think
sure.
that's a critical area of the Martian set of keywords is protector, and
Yes,
that it's almost like a Saint Christopher vibe or something like that
sure.
that comes in.
Yeah,
So,
even if you think about just Mars as being symbolized by a knife throughout history, and then just the role that the knife is used in various magical traditions, it's usually to delimit what is and isn't sacred space, right?
mhm.
It often is employed in like a protective function.
So let's talk a little bit outside because I liked how you brought in as a reminder, at least to me, like those early set of key words, and I recognize them all from traditional Hellenistic astrology, where
Sure.
it's getting down to the elements like heat,
Hmm.
sharpness, dryness, etc.
Sure.
Um, how do you, I guess moving Mars more, say, into the psychological realm,
Hmm.
and how would you see it when it's lost its association with the malefics in astrology? What is there a way you see it, under that rubric? How does that strike you?
Well, great question. I think
You're loving
there's,
all my questions.
yeah, I mean,
Like I'm
they're
scoring. Yay.
definitely thought provoking. Well, I mean, I am personally one person who's I guess like pro using the term malefic and benefic, but that coming with like the added proviso that like you can also have too much of a good thing, or like it's nice to have some spice with your food too, right?
Yes,
Like insofar,
Martian.
yeah, insofar as things are like. Malefic, there's a lot of uncomfortable experiences that can breed growth later on, even if you think of like the ripping of muscle fibers while working out, like that's literally what you're doing, making tiny tears in your muscle tissues, and that's like an act of martial severance, but it leads to growth later on. But if I understand, your question was, where do I locate Mars on a psychological level if we are to remove sort of that label malefic?
Yes, because you've got to communicate with clients that are living in this century, not,
Yes,
ancient Greece. So how,
right.
like what, you know, how do you see it in that respect?
Right. Typically, our prognostications are not going to be that somebody is going to die after being chased by a pack of wild dogs or something.
Or run over by a chariot, right?
Right, exactly, exactly. So like as far as that goes, in like my Mars readings, I approach it from a couple different angles. That is like trying to conjure like a sort of archetypal image of like what is this Mars as a person with a P of some kind. So I call that like Mars as a warrior, right? What kind of warrior? What are they fighting for? Um, and then like a weapon, seeing like Mars as connected to weapons or tools. Mars, according to Valens, rules those who work with their hands. So also think about tools or just weapons in general, right? As they're these extensions of our bodies, extensions of willpower, and therefore everybody's Mars is going to be like a tool, good for certain jobs and not good for others, right?
Yes.
Same way you would use a screwdriver to tighten a screw on a bed frame, but you would not use it to, I don't know, drive a nail, right? So in that same
Sure.
way, like a Mars in Gemini is going to be good at certain tasks that a Mars in Pisces would not be as effective at, right? Um, so I think like finding um, like Mars's ways that Mars can express to have a purpose, have a job. Like that's one way I think you can strip away the maleficence, find the inherent necessity, and say like, okay, well then, like, what are the virtuous uses of this tool, right?
Mhm.
Do you have a screwdriver? Do you have a cast iron skillet, or what have you? Um, and then third, I do kind of recognize some of the subjective difficulty of Mars insofar as saying like Mars can appear as a warrior, like certain kinds of weapons or tools, and then also wounds. Like Mars is still connected to like thorns on rose bushes, right, and like acute injuries. And insofar as that goes, like Mars will bring certain hurts, right? There's certain thorns in one side, but then those themselves can be turned into strengths later on as well. Like, so for instance, if you think of Mars in Libra being like stereotypically like ungraceful, right? If like Libra is a graceful sign and Mars is doing that which is like sort of contra, then you can think of Mars in Libra as being a sort of like ungracefulness. But what if you still do a Venusian thing, but do it with martial tools? So, for instance, James Hetfield of Metallica has Mars in Libra, and is famous for making music, which is like making art, making a beautiful thing, but it's very martial in nature, right?
You kind of you still routed it through the utilitarian
Mm,
view of, not that that's wrong or anything. It's just I was hearing more again of the specific associations with Mars as, surgical or cutting or
sure,
whatnot. And well, and it's great. And I can see how somebody would get insight, say, working with you, and they're getting some kind of overview or highlight about vocational aptitudes
sure,
with, which we need Mars to get ourselves off our ass out into the world, doing things,
sure.
creating things, disturbing things.
I do have an idea that might be helpful here, one thing I've learned over the course of this work, and that is finding Mars in sort of like bodily heat, right? And times when bodily heat is generated. Like you say, stripping away maleficence is just looking for like the psychological substance of Mars. And I think it's like in sort of like animal drives or like ways in which our like instincts can come out in very embodied ways. You know, there are a lot of ways in sort of contemporary life we have created a zoo for ourselves and forgotten how animal, how bestial we still are. You know what I mean?
Very
And I
good
think
point. Yeah.
like having experiences that remind us of sort of the animality of our bodies are very
Mhm.
martial, right? Whether that's just like I don't know, having a really good run, enjoying a really delicious steak, enjoying a really delicious apple, feeling the sunshine on your skin, and then like moreover, you know, Mars. If we're talking about like embodied psychological experiences, that would be like Mars is the fight or flight response, right? And that can
Mhm.
be triggered in ways that are actually you know not just scary but where one is you know I think you'll accuse me for being utilitarian here again but being useful, right? So like the if you've ever been in a situation where you have to be a first responder, right, and apply first aid. There is, in my embodied experience of that, there is the adrenaline rush, but there's this very sharp state of mind that one can sort of drop into if prepared, where there's just like a series of correct things to do to address the injury, to provide aid to the person, or what have you.
So when you and I talked earlier, we got on the topic of how an astrologer's natal chart will influence or impact or provide the type of lens that they are, not only viewing their client's chart through, but also the perhaps the type of astrology that they are practicing. Um, what, given your chart, how do you see that influencing, guiding, or overseeing the work you do with your clients and the type of astrology that you're drawn to?
I don't know if you've had this experience, but I know other astrologer friends who have, wherein a lot of the clients that come to me have similar placements to me, right? There's something to this notion of like having the medicine in order to have the medicine that cures certain ailments, you have to undergo that ailment yourself,
Mhm.
right? So I think, for instance, of like my moon in Scorpio, and just how many people I've read for who also have the moon in Scorpio, right? So I think that has influenced one way I approach client sessions is just if they have similar placements and I have that certain perspective or window into that experience.
Mhm.
Insofar as like tradition or techniques go and what I think is like signified in my own chart. I mean, what I find most appealing or what I found most satisfying, I think about initially like encountering Hellenistic astrology or traditional astrology, quote unquote, like with William Lilly, is this acknowledgement that life contains difficult experiences. Life can be hard. The first noble truth of the Buddha was that life involves some form of suffering. So having an astrology with a vocabulary for suffering, I guess, was important to me early on. And I think maybe you could see that in my chart, wherein like the tightest aspect of my chart is a Mars Saturn trine. So there being like this built-in affinity for the malefics straight out of the gate.
And I'm just being struck again by, and to your point, the resonance between you and I, because, we talked about the lunar Scorpio we share,
Hmm.
and then the sun in the 12th, and then
You
I
also have a
also have
malefic
that
trine.
trine
Yeah.
between Mars and Saturn. So you see that Mars trine as a hallmark of someone that is versed in dealing with the difficulties that the malefics bring because they're in harmony through the trine, or how do you how would you define that?
I one way I think about malefic trines by transit, and we're about to undergo a quite long one because when Mars stations retrograde in Cancer, it's in like a orb of a trine to Saturn um, in Pisces. Is that you have the martial drive, you have martial vigor or martial energy, and then you have Saturn, Lord of Time, Lord of Endurance, who's sort of able to take that and sort of sustain it over a long amount of time. It's like figuring out what is the correct energetic input required to keep this thing going, but without needing to like stop for breaks or break down or run out of energy, right? How do you keep the wheel turning by just like keep like pushing it a little bit at a time, right? So it's kind of like a workhorse aspect, I think, in that way. And then moreover, like, yeah, the fact that they're connected by trine, right? Like this like smooth, harmonious, free flowing aspect. There's a sense of like, yeah, Saturn's sense of discipline, Saturn's sense of, I don't know, taking a broad perspective of things, making an account of sort of ethical obligations to others, and then that being yoked to sort of like martial vigor, you know? Um,
And then
yeah.
being, how do you feel with it? What's your take on it in the water element, especially because we're talking about a transit coming up, uh,
Hmm.
that applied to the, the crazy fucking political landscape, that we find ourselves in now. If
Hmm.
anything, it would be, to me, a combination of Saturn, Mars forces that would find some kind of headway or some kind of
Mm,
pushback.
sure.
But what, what's your take on that brought into real time, being in
Mm.
a water trine, those two planets, and our particular situation in the country right now? I don't assume you're MAGA, so
I am not, and I'm glad you aren't either.
sorry to my MAGA listeners. I'm politically agnostic, but that is some crazy ass shit that we're in. So anyway, go
Truly.
ahead, Caleb.
Yeah. Okay. So thinking about that on a mundane level,
Yeah.
one thing that comes to mind is just like insofar as um, water is concerned, it's let me start over. All right. So with that trine occurring in a water sign, what comes to mind is like Mars in Cancer, like hot sulfurous water, like what comes out of a hot springs, and then Saturn in Pisces as being like the cold plunge. And I don't know if you've ever spent a day doing like soaks and plunges. I've been thinking about like that extreme temperature differential and the way that actually like builds health and vitality.
Mhm.
And this being like an instance wherein like there's something generative to be wrought from discomfort. And at this time, I think there's a real desire to maybe look away from what's going on or what's happening because it can be quite overwhelming. It's quite dystopian. It's quite difficult to know as things become increasingly bizarre and cartoonish at times. Like,
Mhm.
what is truth and what is falsehood, right? Especially with like, I don't know, AI in the mix and the internet to be like the
I
inherent
get it.
trickster quality of the internet. It's like I think there's something to sort of staying with the difficulty or staying with the trouble throughout the month of February and going on into I don't know more of the Trump administration, just staying with like the discomfort and then figuring out how to act from that place once you've stopped I don't know running away from the difficult feeling or emotion or just inherent discomfort.
I'm trying to bring another facet into it that would have to do with, more specifically, well, first of all, I love how you kept it to these real elemental. Oh,
Hmm.
it's here's again to my point about the person's chart being the type of astrology. lens that they move through.
Hmm.
So you, as a Virgo, you got all of these sensate somatic link
Yeah.
up to the two, which is I was listening to that like, God, yeah, I really haven't like looked at it that way.
Mm.
So me and my take, and because like 80% of my chart is water, I'm thinking that there's something that that particular trine has in store for us that is coming from the watery realm, like that it's kind of cogitating and building some imaginal quality that is, I think, very important for people to receive now. And when I what I mean by that is some kind of a picture of like where we might be headed, or somebody stepping up and giving a narrative or a clarion call or fiat saying, and here again, Saturn, Mars working in tandem with the trine,
Hmm.
something that encourages some kind of hope or uh, a, not a feeling of despair.
Right.
So that's, that's kind of how I'm running that through that water lens, I
Yeah.
think, that's there.
One thing that comes to mind when you say that that I'm thinking about is just the fact that like Mars is currently retrograde, but will slow down and station on February 23rd, and then slowly accelerate again. And that's why there's sort of the trine is like extended for its time of application, right? Um, and just the sense of like pivoting, right? That as Mars is retrograde, it feels like things are careening wildly out of control. But like at the station, once one starts to resume forward motion, it's like, okay, we came all the way back to this point. Here's where we are now. What do we do from here? What do we do now? Where do we go from here? And then, like,
Mhm.
once that is ascertained, then stepping in that direction. Yeah, so I think right now there's a lot of just like dismay, disappointment, shock, horror, awe, all that jazz. And then maybe it's like, well, concerted action resumes at that point,
Yeah.
having fully kind of processed just the initial dismay.
So I did a piece a couple weeks ago on my newsletter on Substack. It was called The Man Child Who Came to Dinner.
Mm.
And speaking of water signs, Elon Musk, or as I call him, Elmo Musk, is a double Cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious because of your Martian expertise or specializing, as you
Sure.
call it. I don't know if you looked at Elmo's horoscope up against Trump's. Have you
No,
looked
I'm
at
not
their
familiar. I'm not
synastry?
familiar with their synastry.
Okay, I'll give you the highlight that you're waiting for. Trump, Trump's Mars is at 27, 28 Leo,
Right.
and then Elmo's Mars is 27, 28 Aquarius.
Oh,
Now, if
interesting.
yes, if you had them say Elmo and the Donald are coming to you for a section involving their synastry, how would you approach that? I mean, forget the other stuff,
Sure.
sun, moon, they're having Martian issues or something.
Sure.
How would you? What would be your take on that Mars in Aquarius exact opposition to Mars in Leo?
Interesting. That's fascinating that they're like their Mars placements are locked in opposition if they're and seem to be working so closely in tandem at this time. Um, yeah, I guess insofar as that opposition goes, that sort of sense that they exist on opposite ends of a polarity or a spectrum, right? Or that they seem to have completely antithetical Mars placements. I think there is something to the notion that even even in the opposition, like signs that are opposed, there's actually a lot that um, there's a lot in common insofar as like you can't have a disagreement with someone unless you both care about the same things. Like if one of you didn't care, there wouldn't be a disagreement or there wouldn't be a division or strife, right? Um,
Okay, yeah, I'm hearing your Mars and Libra now. Go ahead though.
yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure.
No,
But
that's
like
cool. I think you're absolutely right. Opposites attract.
to some degree, yes. To some degree, yes. There's like some desire, I think, to like find some completion, right, in the other. But also, I'm just like, I think with Leo and Aquarius, like that axis, I think it speaks to a lot of like conflicts between what is central and what is at the fringes or what is avant-garde, and the tenuous relationship between those, right? So like that which is at the center is prioritized, and that which is at the fringes is often like marginalized or like left out, right, in some way, shape, or form. And yet, that which is at the fringes, because it is so far away, so distant, has a completely different perspective, which can sort of refresh, renew, and offer like rejuvenation, right, to that which is central, right? Um,
I know. Okay, I want to follow you. So when you're talking about avant-garde or fringe, that's Mars and Aquarius.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, and then being more the center would be what would the Mars and Leo would be the
Mars and Leo is that which is like central. There's like Mars, the decan in which the Donald's Mars is placed is also a Mars ruled decan, one that I think it's the astrologer Austin Koppe who's called the banner or the flag, something like that, and sort of talks about the image, how they're like centralizing images, right? If you think of the emblems and symbols on flags,
Mhm,
they sort
mhm.
of unite people, like people stand around, they fight and defend a flag, right? And everything that flag represents, right?
Where would
I
that
think
be?
that's
MAGA?
yeah, exactly. He's become this like rallying point for people. And I think it's actually kind of fascinating how Elon Musk went from like years ago being somebody who found his like ways into the good graces of the Obama administration by basically like receiving a lot of funding early on for Tesla, right? With sort of promises that green energy was coming, that he would be sort of this like Henry Ford figure for like a green future almost, only for him to turn into like Lex Luthor, right? Um, and just thinking of like how the sort of the end goals of a lot of his sort of like his own corporate aspirations run contra to the actual needs probably of most of the Donald's like working class supporters. You know what I mean? Like
Mhm,
people whose jobs could be disrupted through automation
mhm,
or the use of AI or I don't know any number of um, like the use of robotics, right? The use of robotics to replace labor, things like that.
mhm. Well,
Um,
okay. So I see
yeah,
your point there. Are you done on that?
yeah,
Or
yeah.
okay. Um, I think being fixed signs that is the one of the key elements here, and
Hmm.
possibly the bonding element in something potentially so tempestuous. The fixed signs I always associate with finances: Taurus, Scorpio, Aquarius, Leo. So I think that has a lot to do with it's almost like a couple in a bad marriage, and then the husband has all the money, and then the MAGA wife has to stay in the marriage, for support.
Hmm.
In other words, I think Trump is hypnotized by this goofy uh, moniker of, the world's wealthiest man,
Mm.
Elon Musk.
Yeah.
So I think that is going to be a stickler there for all of us that are hoping for the opposition between them to explode into volcanic melt.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of Trump's recent campaign was like straight up bankrolled by Elon Musk, right?
$280 million from
Jeez.
Elmo. Yeah, that was
Yeah.
quite a lot of money.
Whew.
All right. So, like, what are you, as a professional, working, active astrologer involved in the culture and your world around you, what is it? What are you really mulling over or inquiring into? Like, what's got your
Mhm.
attention, and that you find yourself kind of orbiting as a topic, or that you keep coming back to?
Sure. Yeah. I think my primary interest, and this has been since kind of like April last year, it's something that's been gestating and is not fully realized. I don't know in which, like, what form it will eventually be realized, but it kind of flows on from what we were talking earlier about, like, somehow recognizing the inherent necessity of Mars and Saturn. And, so much of Mars's traditional associations are connected to civilizational ills, right? Like murder and war. Like predation occurs in the natural world, right? Like,
Yes.
but wolves don't go to war against deer, right? Like war is like a creation of humans who live in societies who are fighting over resources or for religious reasons or what have you, right? Um, so like I've been sort of like there's this like philosophical inquiry I've been ruminating upon, which is like who or what are the malefics when stripped of like all the ills that we put upon them, because we have created a society that is often bananas, right? So we have like some planet has to have be attributed those things, but if the world was not that way, what would the planet still signify? Or like put another way, in prehistory, what would those planets signify? And I guess like the conclusion I've come to with Mars is that like Mars is encountered in the wild, like what we were talking about earlier about just like the animal body, right? The sensation of like being out in the woods, the like embodied activity of foraging for one's food, hunting for one's food, learning how to track one's prey, learning how to survive, the development of skills and tools in order to survive, the protecting of your clan or tribe, the creation of shelter, right, the ensurement of sustenance, and then also like dangerous encounters with other animals that are also trying to survive, right? Like the jockeying of wills, right? Like human beings in prehistoric times butting up against like cave bears across Eurasia, right? And like
Right.
the competing real estate market of like caves, right? Humans and bears both wanted them for shelter, right? And how do you figure that out? Do you fight the bear, right, for the sake of your tribe? So like there's this bigger picture thing that I'm like working on, where like I think I'm really interested to see how like um, there's sort of like a contemporary movement right now that shows up in a couple different ways called rewilding, right? And that might mean taking a space that was once used for agriculture or like a golf course and then rewilding it, like
Yeah, I've heard
allowing
of
like
this. Yes.
yeah, like plants, animals to
Mhm.
return, or restorations of ecosystems. So I'm trying to think with like, what does it mean to rewild Mars, right? What does it to be to allow Mars to be a wild thing, like a wolf, like if Mars is identified with wolves, and just thinking about like the ways that humans have treated wolves over the past thousands of years, all the like subjectively negative things, like ways wolves play roles in like fairy tales, right? Like the
Right.
Big Bad Wolf and Little Red Riding Hood. Um, but then also like recognizing the ecological necessity of the wolf. You need wolves and other predators to, for instance, like eat the sick from bison herds and antelope herds and deer herds, right?
Okay, so you're taking this and running it through like a some kind of an outline or a plan.
Been
Wh-
about like the collection of texts and
And
the writing of mini essays, but nothing has reached the light of day yet. But it's something, as I said, that's sort of in a like gestational phase still.
So this is heading into some kind of like a book or a thesis or something of that nature,
Yeah, I would
you're
say
saying?
so. Yes.
So I think that would be something welcome, to the astro community of
Hmm.
that kind of primordial, like you're saying, what were these functions or forces or instincts like, before humans became, civilized or
Hmm.
whatever, and then, getting back in touch with that. There's a book that's coming to mind while I was listening to you by Morris Berman,
Mm.
and he is a historian, anthropologist, is a professor. He fled the US and is now living in Mexico wisely.
Wow.
But the book is called Coming to Our Senses. And I'm just getting that this would be a book that you would revel in.
Mm.
I've read it twice because it is such a meaty, you just can't, like, I don't know, read it on the bus or something. You've got to sit
Sure.
down, be able to focus and take in this rich uh, set of insights he has about how disconnected people have become from their bodies,
Ah.
from the animal kingdom,
Hmm.
and then also how we treat animals is
Yes.
another indication of our terrible relationship to our own, inner animal. People forget they're mammals. Now, of speaking of thesis books, something I'm looking at right now, which has kind of gotten under my skin, is the blanket, I don't know, uh, response that I'm getting from people, other astrologers, when I bring up the terrifying topic of the Southern Hemisphere. So I'm going to ask you this, which is, like I said, I'm talking to other people about, and it's not a pop quiz.
Right.
Um, for the listener, I'll just say quickly that Western astrology, as it's practiced today, is based on the notion that the signs of the zodiac are all tied to the seasonal shifts
Hmm.
in the Northern Hemisphere. So the reason you always hear about Aries being, self-starters and they can't stop going, it's all the association with the spring equinox where the world returns to activity. Now, if you're down in Australia, there's a whole other thing going on. So tell me your take on that, and then I'll go into some of my explorations, which I think you'll find interesting, actually, and it might pique you as well.
I'd love to hear if you come to more firm conclusions than myself, because right now I confess it's mostly like speculation. It's like,
I bet
uh,
that's what I need to hear. I'm getting
yeah.
everybody's take on this.
So one, I like that you provided the introduction saying like, okay, look, the Western tropical zodiac is tied to the movement of the sun. This would be a different question entirely if we were using a sidereal zodiac and it was tied to the position of the stars, right? And you're
Right.
primarily delineating the sign's meaning by something stellar, right? But instead, because it's something solar, but the solar journey means something else entirely in the southern hemisphere, right? Do, okay, so like one thing I've contemplated is like, well, maybe the southern hemisphere just needs to flip everything, right? Like their Aries season can be our Libra season and so on, right? That's one of my more like harebrained ideas because if it is more about like fluctuating levels of light and dark, maybe that would work, but I don't think that would then like hold true for the other planets beyond the sun as they transit through different signs, right? Um,
Well, and never mind the moon nodes totally like
yes.
flipped on. So there's, that part of it too. But go ahead.
So, there's that idea, but then I think there's the more challenging, like, contemplation where it's like, can you sense the energy of Aries during a time period? Like, can you strip your northern hemispheric associations and see maybe the fire of Aries being deeply important during the hemisphere's start of autumn because of the necessity of fire during increasingly colder days or something like that, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, what conclusions have your ruminations yielded?
Well, that what you just noted is something I've been toying around with, like just looking at, okay, it's the start of our spring up here, autumn down there, and then looking at, to me, those are dramatic shifts in
Hmm.
seasons, spring
Hmm.
and autumn. And so there's similarities to me in that the dramatic quality there. And then you could just apply that, to the other way that the seasons are flipped. So that's something I've been looking at. But my inquiry went into an entirely different direction, and that was based on my friendship with David Roll. I don't I don't know if you were familiar with him. He was an astrologer out near New York. He's an Aquarian, so this will prepare you for what I started to get into dialogue with David about. And David developed a theory that I think Dane Rudger made some allusions to in some of his writing, like in the Astrology of Personality. Don't know if you read that book. It's sort of his like pinnacle um, tome. And it's where you look at the Earth, the zodiac as the Earth's aura, and it takes it out of this battle between, the constellations and the ecliptic and the path of the sun. And it's really like looking at this aura of the planet that the Earth is sort of moving in like a gyroscope.
Hmm.
But there's this kind of continuum to that shape. And David, now this is where I loved where David was coming from. David got the idea that there was like this gigantic like crystal at like a hexagonal crystal at the center of the earth, and this somehow was generating these six, polarities that radiate out into the Earth's aura as the zodiac. Interestingly enough, not long after he came up with this, I think it was a couple guys, two geologists, or I don't know what their exact job description was, something like exploring the Earth, the crust, the core, all of that.
Hmm.
They posited that there is at the center of the Earth this gigantic crystal. And you can actually Google this and read all about it. I'm not that well versed in it to go into it right now, but it did give credence to what David was talking about. And that's what I've been trying to look at because I'm not a siderealist, and I also find this dichotomy that's unsolved with northern southern hemisphere. It's
Hmm.
kind of a Achilles heel in the astrological matrix.
Hmm.
Thoughts, prayers, what do you?
Insofar as that goes, I like how, on a certain level, that notion affirms the importance of the Earth itself as sort of the most important planet in astrology,
Exactly. Well,
you
this is what
know?
this is what David kept saying. He goes, astrology is of the earth. It's not
Right.
up in the air. It's earth, air, fire, water, all of
Hmm.
these elements on this beautiful planet that we abide on.
Right, right. And also like our it's our vantage point. Like without the unique perspective of being on this planet, of being of this planet, like astrology would not look the way it is. And if we were to conceive of it while living on Mars, it would be a completely different system, right? Because our vantage point, our perspective would be different, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, that concludes part one of my discussion with Caleb. And we will be back next week with part two. And this is going to be the section of the video that will interest you the most, as we are going to go sign by sign through the zodiac, looking at the various positions of natal Mars in the horoscopes. So we'll be going from Aries to Taurus to, all the way around. And it's a great listen. So please join us, and I'll see you along with Caleb next week.